Siddiqui, Head of Diversity at the IPA, and I'm very excited to announce our brand new series of Diversity Roundtables. These discussions are designed in order to do a little bit of mini deep dive into some of the key issues around diversity, everything from gender and ethnicities through to disabilities and LGBT. We're hoping to have conversations with senior leaders who have made great progress within the area of diversity within their own organizations, with a view to sharing best practice, talking a little bit about the common challenges we all face, and also celebrate some of the great work that's currently being done. The topic of diversity has been at the forefront of the industry for a while now, particularly in the last 18 months. We see the conversation becoming a lot stronger, and especially after what's been happening on the wider political and economic scale. So whether it's the US elections or closer to home, the results from the referendum, we think that diversity is more relevant today than it's ever really been before. And how far off are we really with regards to representing diversity within our businesses and within our advertising? When are we actually going to represent multicultural Britain? And how can we as individuals work on raising awareness within our own organizations so that our workforce is as inclusive as possible? I'm so excited to have you all here today. Thank you very much for joining. Let me start off by introducing you one by one, and then we'll just get to the heart of the matter. So we have Ross King, Director of Marketing Communications at Lloyds Banking Group. Ross works across all of the group's brands and has brought back the Black Horse to Lloyds. Nadia is one of the most well-known and well-liked individuals within the advertising business. And is on a mission to deliver business change by harnessing the power of creative thinking. She has successfully built 3 world-class businesses, including Dare, which won Agency of the Decade in 2010, and Sunshine. Moving on, we have Sarah Churchman, who is Human Capital Director, Head of Talent Inclusion and Wellbeing at PwC. Sarah is a senior human resources professional with over 30 years of experience, and her career has been dedicated to helping large and complex organizations deliver the transformation required to attract and retain diverse talent. And we have Siobhan Brunwyn, who is from MEC, which is one of the world's leading advertising media planning agencies. With expertise in digital media and social marketing. And Siobhan is passionate about diversity, in particular apprenticeships and continuous professional development. So let's kick off and get straight to it. What does diversity mean to you, both personally and professionally? Ross, we'll start off with you.
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, I think for me, it's about inclusion, really. It's about equality of opportunity. It's about lack of bias. And then it's also about, in your DNA, believing that teams are better if you have diverse people there with different views, different experiences, and different opinions. So I think it has to be something that's felt as well as believed.
Absolutely. Nadia?
I think diversity for me, comes back to total equality and fairness. I fundamentally believe nobody deserves an extra start in life just because of what they look like or where they come from. Everyone should start from the same place. And I think what sort of placed that so clearly to me was when I was doing the Christmas So White campaign, and I was at my daughter's school and I was looking at images at Christmas. Little girl said, I want to see images of my mum and I, images of a mum doing snowball fights. And we looked at all these images on Google and they were all of a white family and she was a little black girl. And it was then that I realised that from the moment she was born, she was being treated like a second-class citizen. And to me, that's just not the world I want to grow up in. And that change has to come from business, because ultimately we will all have a job. And if the place where we work doesn't treat us equally, then we will never be equal. So it comes down to a fundamental sense of fairness.
I think, yes, it's all about difference in the broadest sense. And I think generally now the word is associated with the kind of legal protected characteristics. But I think if you think about fairness and equality, I think those who have always experienced equality and basically are privileged, I don't have a clue what lack of fairness or equality is. So I think a big part of this agenda is helping to hold up the mirror to people to see that the premise that life is fair, from which many people come from, and they therefore think interventions are acts of positive discrimination, is completely flawed.
And so social mobility is a crucial part of that, and one of the government's current key strategic priorities as well.
Yeah.
Siobhan.
So to echo what you all just said, really, I think it's mostly for me about inclusion. I think especially in the workplace, our workplaces have to reflect the society that we live in. In Adland, we need to have people planning and designing campaigns that reflect the people that we're aiming those campaigns at.
Now, it's really interesting that each of you have been featured in our Diversity Hub as well for one project or the other that you guys have been doing. So I'd like to just take the opportunity to sort of dig a little bit deeper and hear in a little bit more detail about some of the work that you've been involved in within your organizations. So I'll start with Ross. So Ross, the recent report that was done by Lloyds Banking Group, fascinating and very, very inspiring. How did the idea sort of come up, and what inspired you to kick this movement?
Well, Lloyds Banking Group is very committed to diversity for employees, and we bank 30 million people, so we basically bank modern Britain.
Me.
So we really wanted to take a look at the world of advertising and answer two questions, really. One is, does advertising reflect modern Britain? And the other one is it favourable for brands if they do reflect modern Britain? So we really wanted to talk to customers and get their point of view on it. And we did four pieces of work. The first was a big quantitative piece of research with 2,000 respondents who were reflective of modern Britain.
Wow.
To ask their views about whether they thought advertising reflected modern Britain and how they felt about advertisers that do and don't. The second piece was an audit of all of the advertising of the top 20 advertisers in 2015 to literally count whether modern Britain was reflected in advertising or not. The third piece, we worked with our agency Adam and Eve, and we created two ads, one for a packaged goods product and one for a financial services product, and we then recreated those ads multiple times to have a lead protagonist with different groups, and we researched them amongst all those different groups. We researched all of them with all the different groups to get their feedback and thoughts. And finally, we took the same advertising and put it into focus groups, and we also put in what we considered to be best-in-class diversity advertising to get people's thoughts and views on the advertising we'd created, but also advertising that other people had created. So the first thing that's really interesting, so in counting the top 20 advertisers, only 19% of all advertising featured people from the diverse groups we'd highlighted. Now, considering that included ethnic diversity, age over 65, which is a pretty huge group, parent families, for it to only be 19% is very, very low indeed. And we've got all the breakdown for all the different groups and what's featured. In terms of the questionnaire that we asked, we found that most people felt that advertising didn't represent them. So, in fact, the group that most felt that modern British advertising reflected them was two-parent families, and that was 55%, and the group that least felt it was gay women, which was down as low as 21%. And on the whole, the more minority groups were at the lower end there, so they felt that advertising reflected them less well. But perhaps the optimistic note in all of this was that 65% of people believed that advertisers should do more to reflect modern Britain. So we've got huge permission to actually try to be more reflective, and we also got some really good learnings about how to do that, but I won't take up all the time now. So it's all in the survey. Here you go. There you go.
We must all read that. I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about the Great British Diversity Experiment and what sort of next, because I know that you're working on perhaps a second version of the experiment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the inspiration for the Great British Diversity Experiment came from desire to do something unique and bespoke to the creative industries, because we've got the stats from McKinsey which say that from a profit perspective then diversity is great, but they don't tell you why or how, and there's nothing specific to the creative sector. And we spent a long time trying to work out how we could achieve some kind of meaningful findings. And working with Flamingo, who are an amazing research business, we decided to recruit 140 truly diverse people from all walks of life. We managed to be incredibly representative. The two most difficult for us to recruit were ability and age. Interestingly, age was really challenging. I ended up phoning up all my university friends who were only 42, but they were representing, helping me get the age over. So we recruited 140 people. We had a brief from Tesco's, which was on how to solve the problem of food wastage. And we divided the people up into 20 different teams to work on this brief. And we manufactured the team so that they were incredibly diverse. And then we ethnographically studied what happened when they worked together. We had a really long debate about what was the control group, and then we worked out it was everyday life. So we didn't really need a control group. We assigned mentors to each team because we were really worried that if you had groups of very different people, there could be infighting, like one-manship, upmanship, all that kind of thing. Actually, the teams got on brilliantly, and one of the main things that came out of them working together was they all said, if everyone's different, no one's different. So the main things were, we found that the creative process was undeniably incredibly rich, and much richer than normal, because you had a diversity of opinion and experiences coming into it. And the team that won, actually one of the biggest teams, there was 10 of them, and in that team you had a young man who'd grown up in Albania during food rationing. You had another woman who'd grown up in South Africa, where food and food poverty is a real problem. Now, if you briefed me on something around what's the problem with food wastage, I'd go, is there a problem with food wastage? I mean, I try and eat all my food, but sometimes I throw away some bagged salad. Is that a problem? When speaking to someone who suffered from food rationing or grown up in extreme poverty, they have a totally different perspective on food wastage. The other thing that came out of it was slower and messier. Now, that is better because you don't get cultural consensus. So the third thing, which I think is worth noting, that came out of it was the challenge for leadership. So if you have an autocratic leader, there is absolutely no point having a diverse group of people because they will smother the diverse voices in the room. So the big sort of challenge to everybody who we worked with was, if you want to enable diversity and get the benefits of diversity, then your leaders have to be something called active enablers. Published the report. I wish I'd brought a copy of the report now. You've got your published the report back in March last year. We've now decided to repeat the exercise, but across multiple sectors, because doing it within advertising alone meant that, one, a lot of publications were interested in covering it because they see advertising as potentially a bit privileged. But two, it reduces it down to one area of commercial creativity. So we're looking to run it again this year within technology, within product and service design, within advertising, within broadcast, and also within theatre. And we'll be working with Flamingo again and Centaur Media as our media partner.
Fantastic. That's really, really exciting. And given the response you got to the first, I remember you had a launch event at BBH.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's really good. It's really good.
Yeah, it was fantastic. There's a lot of goodwill behind that.
The challenge is to get Martin Sorrell and ex-white man and ex-white man to sit down and read it and then make changes on the back of it.
Yeah.
So I think for the second one, we want the blueprint element. So what do you do now? Almost one lady described to me a pick and lift, so that when we're talking to some of the senior white men in power, we can say to them, this is what you need to do. It's been proven to work. You guys have trialled it and it worked. You guys have trialled it and it worked. You need to set up a diversity steering committee. You need to have someone on your board of boards who runs that.
It's really good to have that validation and that evidence base now that you can point towards and say, well, actually diverse teams do better and they do come up with fresher ideas.
In R&D and engineering, there is lots and lots of evidence that diverse teams come up with better solutions, but not within the creative industry. So that's what we're trying to just establish, that real blueprint.
Sarah, so how is it like at PwC from you're such a big employer? You win lots of awards every year, the Times sort of top 100 employers, and how is it like to manage diversity within such a large organization? And also you do some really interesting work with regards to the way you measure and you monitor data. And I remember we had a really interesting chat last year where you said something that really struck a chord with me, which was that the data told you a very different story from what you thought was the case. and that the big challenge with regards to gender is progression, and the challenge with regards to ethnicities is retention. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I think we're a big sort of global employer, and we're big in the UK as well, about 22,000 people here in the UK. And I think, linking actually to what you've just been saying, interestingly, I think unless diversity is seen as a critical business issue, it is very difficult to make any progress at all. So we talk about our purpose at PwC, which is solving complex problems and building trust. How can we build trust if we present a very homogenous type of person to our increasingly diverse clients? How can we solve complex problems if everyone thinks in the same way? How can we bring sort of new thinking and dynamism to our, developing products and services? So it's kind of critical to the business. But we are PwC, we love data, so we don't do anything unless we've got loads of, well-analysed data. So we have what we call a data-driven approach, and it drives all of our action. And I can remember going back literally about 10 years ago now, going to my board with some, we'd now call it predictive analytics, but at the time we just called it our flow rates analysis. But it was looking at the underlying trends of movements of men and women in the firm, and also our majority and minority ethnic staff. And initially the board didn't believe it because it wasn't what they were expecting. They thought we had so few women in the partnership because they all left to have babies, ... What the data showed, and still to this day, if we were only going to recruit for loyalty, we'd only recruit women because they're fabulous. They stay with the organisation, and we don't have a retention problem. We have an issue in ensuring they remain on track and they are progressing. So that has been the kind of the activity that we've been focused on for the last 10 years with results. And if you've got good data, you can measure your results, and then you can also set yourself some targets. On ethnicity, I think what is quite interesting is we do a fabulous job of attracting in really diverse, ethnically diverse talent at the school leaver level and the graduate level. But we lose too many of them before they make manager, even get to middle manager. But those who stay tend to do really well, but we've lost too many. And so the focus there, so there's a completely different set of actions that you have to do. I mean, part of the challenge around retention is people looking up and not seeing very many people like them. And if you just look at the latest reports from Ruby McGregor-Smith or Sir John Parker, I mean, it's not just confined to my own organisation, it's kind of pretty well universal. It's, it's appalling. And so you end up with completely different programmes of activity, but it's kind of targeted and it's rooted in data. But the actions you take, I think we kind of distilled down into three simple areas. One is leadership and accountability. You've got to have top-level support, otherwise you're on hiding to nothing. And not just the spoken word of support, I think you have to drive accountability as well. We're talking now about accountability with consequences, both good and bad. Because if people are taking this seriously, then why would they not be as fluent with their diversity performance as they are as their financial performance? So let's make them accountable and let there be consequences for delivering against their targets, which we have set and which we have published, both for gender and ethnicity. The second area is around critical interventions. So when you identify your hotspots based on the data, what are the interventions you need to make, whether it's kind of sponsorship programs for talented women and minorities or mentoring programs, whatever, but you need those, you need to intervene to ensure the playing field is level and everyone has a fair access to the opportunities that are available. And then the final area is around awareness and education. And I think there it's very much looking at helping people to understand that we're all part of the problem as being part of the solution. So we all have our own preferences. We all like to work with people like ourselves because it's easy. You can second guess what people are thinking. It makes decision making quick. Doesn't necessarily give you the best results though. So we all have to get used to feeling a little bit uncomfortable surrounding ourselves by people who aren't like ourselves. So tackling those unconscious biases. But I think also just making everybody aware that just because you've never felt excluded doesn't mean exclusion isn't rife. So I think focusing on how do you develop leaders to be much more inclusive, both in their mindset but in their actions as well, is really important. So it's a simple model. We call it our ecosystem. Just what is a complex issue? We're trying to distill down to some sort of a small number of effective interventions, which we measure. As you'd expect.
It's really interesting. And how do you hold sort of leadership accountable to this? Is this something that managers at every level are sort of held responsible for within their teams?
We're starting with those who have the most power, if you like, in our organisation, so our business unit leaders. and we'll sort of take it from there. But we've kind of said they are accountable for some years, but there's never really been any consequences to that accountability. So we're trying to, we're working it out now. How do you create some metrics that don't drive the wrong behaviours?
Yes.
There's easy ways of hitting your targets, but actually behaving very, very badly. So you've got to balance the kind of the measurement with the appropriate behaviour. It's matching literally the diversity with inclusive behaviours.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. Thank you, Sarah. And Shiv, so coming from a very cool, very trendy agency with lots of young people as well, which is a good thing and a bad thing. How do you guys have been doing some really cool work in the diversity space. For example, you had the Face of Advertising campaign that you launched during Ad Week Europe a few weeks ago. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so at Ad Week we had an interaction called Brave Your Bias. The idea from that actually came from an internal competition that we ran, a bit like a sort of Can Young Lion. We do like an internal version of that, and an idea that two of our graduates came up with was this sort of creating the Face of Adland, and then we made it. And the first day of advertising week, we tried to get as many people as possible to come and have their picture taken, which is quite difficult on a Monday morning. So we created this technology with an outsourced company. People had their picture taken, and then we merged all the faces together. And surprisingly, we had a white man at the end of the day, which reflected the sort of face of advertising. He did look slightly older than actually we thought he would, or they would. And during that day as well, we were encouraging people to take the Harvard bias test as well, to brave their bias. And we had a diversity coach on site to talk about issues and challenges that people had, because people get a bit angry when they do those tests. Yes. They think, oh no, but I'm not this and I'm not that.
Absolutely. And also, I know you're quite passionate about apprenticeships, and you manage the apprenticeship programs at MEC. Do you want to really quickly talk us a little bit about?
So apprenticeship levy is very timely. At the moment, everyone's getting into apprenticeships. I know Lloyds and PwC have done some great work around that space. So we have 10 apprentices that we've just made permanent. We're keeping all of them. Brilliant. And we are taking 10 more this year. And we've actually set ourselves a target this year that 50% of those apprentices have to be from a BAME background, or from SE1, which is where our office is based, which is one of the least affluent boroughs in London. We really want to make sure that we're reflecting the local community. And also, we are going to try and get some apprentices that are over 50 as well. That's in our target. Yeah, so we talked about age. And we sort of did a bit of a debate around age, sort of end of last year. Unfortunately, we're classing older people as over 40 in advertising.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah. I think, but you do, I'm 42 now, and I do go, can I do this job past 50?
I was actually told by a headhunter that if I wanted to work in advertising now, I should move to New York, because at my age, I was unemployable in London.
Wow. It's a really good point, because in New York, there are a lot of people in advertising.
Yeah, there are. Generally.
Age is valued, seems to be valued a lot more, whereas in London, age is really undervalued.
So if we were to just go around the table very quickly and just to sum up, and almost in the form of sound bites, if you can come up with a line or two about what you think organizations or agencies could be doing right now in order to start thinking about more inclusive cultures. What would you say? Should we start off with you?
Well, I'm actually going to go back to Reflecting Modern Britain, if I may, and just say I think there's two things from it for me. One is our customers want us to reflect modern Britain, so I think it's important that agencies believe that and therefore feel brave enough to give it a go. And the other thing is that I think it's got to be non-superficial. So it can't just be at the casting stage, or when you're looking for a library shop that you then just say, well, let's make sure we've got one of everything in this. It's actually got to be much more strategic and much more fundamental, and the insight and the research and the strategies have to start from a place of inclusion and really believing that, that we should listen to all of our customers and reflect them in our advertising. And I think if they do those two things, they'll make big strides forward.
I don't think it starts with recruitment and ends with recruitment. one of the things that you were just talking about a moment is, and I've heard it so many times, when someone is brought in and they come from a different socioeconomic background or a different ethnic background, and after a year or two they do not feel like they belong, so they leave. So you've invested time and money into bringing them into the organisation, into training them, but because you haven't created an environment where their difference is valued, they leave, and that will cost you money. So if you're serious about diversity, you have got to think about the whole journey that person is going to go on to. And the third is the leadership. If the leadership don't believe that diversity is of value, then your business will not ever be successful at diversity.
I think if organisations really see this as critical to their business, they should therefore deal with it as any other business critical factor, you know. And I think there is something, we're seeing other sectors do this, but sort of reporting on their progress. So what are their ambitions in this space? You know, why are they taking it seriously? Why is it a priority for them? How convincing are they in telling the world that this is critical to their business, they understand it, and then holding themselves up to be measured as well. So putting information out there, and because it starts from within. You know, how diverse is their own workforce, and is that diversity therefore matching their evolving customer base? I think also talk about some of the risks they feel they're taking in this space, because my view is, if you're, you know, trolling along feeling very comfortable with your customers, with your people, you know, you're fishing in the same talent pools, etc., you're going to be doing nothing to advance this agenda.
I do think that's an important point around generosity on that, because the PwC report is so good at giving confidence, I think, to other organisations, publishing the finding of what would have been probably a costly and time-consuming study, and generously publishing it, I think is critical. So I do think there's a challenge to trailblazers to continue to be generous and share their findings, because that amount of intellectual capital about their, you know, on diversity will help other leaders feel braver to do more. So I do think that's critical, that those sort of things carry happening. And thank you for doing it.
Yeah, I think cross collaboration is quite key within different sectors. Shiv?
I think if you can use your apprenticeship levy, if you can set yourself some targets. I do think sometimes quotas are the only way to advance change. I don't think they're the answer, but I think sometimes we need to force this stuff. And if it's not measured, and if there's not data against it, is it going to get done? And putting it out there publicly. And I think the IPA, you know, make the leap stuff to agree to at least be trying to get a certain amount of women on boards and BAME representation. You know, that's something you can measure and you can aim towards. So if you don't measure it, it doesn't get done, right?
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think holding yourselves accountable to targets is really, really important. Thank you so much for a really honest and interesting discussion. I think I learned a lot from it. I hope the people who are watching feel inspired and in a position to start thinking more about taking risks, because that came up in the conversation quite a lot. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting us. Thank you.
Well done.